Next up, we have Jing talking about the ins and outs of data files. And Jing is currently in Nepal and wasn't able to make it today, but she was kind enough to record her talk so you can all see it right now. Let's do it.
Hello everyone. This is the first time I'm presenting at an online conference, so it's pretty cool to be speaking to everyone from my own room for a change. It is also my first JekyllConf, so all this is kind of exciting. Now today I'm going to be talking about how I used data files to help me manage the website for Singapore CSS, which is the only CSS-centric meetup group in Singapore at the moment. My name is Jing, and these are the emojis that pretty much describe who I am as a person. There is also a diagram explaining my name because I found that Chinese names can sometimes be confusing. Anyway, feel free to interpret the emojis however you like. If any of them don't make sense to you, maybe you could tweet me or something, and I'll explain myself to you. I also have a day job, because gainful employment is kind of a good look on me. Currently, I'm with Nexmo as a developer advocate in charge of the APAC region, and Nexmo is a company that does communication APIs for messaging, voice, verification, amongst a couple of others. So Jekyll is currently on version 4.00, which was released last month in August. Now, if you are on GitHub Pages, then the GEMS version is 3.8.5. The ability to store data in external files and then access this data was first introduced in 2013 for the 1.3.0 release, so it had already been a feature when I picked up Jekyll for the first time. Now, there are loads of static generators out there today, and if we look at the most popular few, Jekyll isn't the only one that supports external data files. Hugo, right, has something similar, but it's called templates. Gatsby, the up-and-comer that has grown like immensely, they use GraphQL to manage their data sources. Honestly, it's pretty powerful. Hang on, now that I think about it, I have no idea what Next.js does. But anyway, my point is, the ability to access custom data stored in external files makes maintenance and organization of a site much easier to handle. So let's go through some very basic data file basics in Jekyll. To use them, you'd place the data files you'd like Jekyll to access in an underscore data folder on the root of your project. Jekyll will then pass this data during the site generation process, and the data in those files can be accessed in your templates with the syntax site.data. Whatever you named your data file. For example, here I've got two blocks of code. One is the data file on the left, the right side is my template. If I wanted to display a list of speakers on the template with data pulled from the speaker.yaml file, I would do a for loop. As you can see, there's a for speaker in site.data.speakers. And this for loop is going to run through every entry in the data file, and this will pick out the relevant fields I want formatted in a very specific way on the template. So you can see that I've used something like if speaker1.twitter, I'll talk about that a bit later. There's also the bit about the bio, there's also a bit about speaker image and things like that. And all this information is actually pulled from the speakers.yaml file. So Jekyll supports 4 file formats, right? YAML, JSON, CSV, and TSV. And we can shape the data in these files to suit our needs via the Liquid templating engine. Now, if you're already very familiar with Liquid, well, please bear with me, or take this as a refresher, because I will be going into some features of Liquid that are very relevant when dealing with custom data. So maybe, think of this as a data files and Liquid templating engine talk. Why not? Now, like most self-respecting templating engines, There are numerous functions to add logic to your templates. We've got the basic logical and comparison operators. So equals, not equals, less than, greater than, inclusive. We've got an or, we've got an and. Some of you might notice that there's like an omission here, but we'll talk more about that later on. Then of course we have truthiness, we have control flow, iterators, we have variables and filters. Again, all these very typical in many templating engines, but there are some Liquid-specific behaviors and limitations that we do need to wrap our heads around and kind of grasp and understand so we can work more efficiently with it. So as a web developer, my main programming language of choice is JavaScript. Please don't judge me, but this is probably why I'm not entirely surprised by the slight weirdness of truthiness and falsiness in Liquid. The key point here, and I want to highlight, is that we need to be aware that everything in Liquid is truthy by default, unless it resolves explicitly to false or it's a nil value. So what this means is that strings and arrays, they're considered truthy even if there's nothing in them, even when they're empty. Their mere existence is truth. The same goes for the number 0, any integers, any floats. I think you're starting to get the picture about truthiness in Liquid. Now nil is a special empty value that is returned when Liquid cannot find anything to return. It is not a string with the characters nil. The letters N, I, and L don't show up anywhere. It is essentially nothing. And now that we've sorted that out, let's talk about control flow. Now control flow is, I would say, pretty standard in Liquid, except for the fact that there is an AND operator, we've got an OR operator, but we don't have a NOT operator, and this is the omission I was talking about. There is something called an unless operator though, which kind of behaves like a NOT, but not exactly, so we kind of have to like fudge it a bit. So it's possible to achieve the effect of a NOT operator, but we would have to nest conditionals instead of putting them all on the same line. So for example, to have a conditional like if A and B and not C, you'd first have to do an if A and B conditional block and then nest an additional unless C conditional block within that previous A and B block. So this particular example, and if you wanted to see the code instead of just listen to me talk through it, I picked this up from a GitHub issue on the Liquid repository, which got reopened a couple of times over the past 7 years, I think. It is currently still open today. Clearly, not is something most people expect, but unfortunately is not provided as a basic operator. Okay, I apologize for my utterly terrible humor. But instead we have unless. And as long as the specified condition within the conditional block is not met, the code block is going to render. So all the stuff in this particular example, if my post has a front matter value of special true, the content inside my unless block is not going to show up. But if not, so like if my post is not special, then it's going to render as normal. So could I achieve the same effect with an if-else block using, say, page.special as a variable in the conditional? Well, as a matter of fact, yes. Yes, I could do that. But I think it's nice to have options, no? So moving on to iterators. Now iterators are pretty key because I think iterators are a major motivation for most people to want to even use templating languages in the first place, right? Now when we think back on data, like we're actually talking about pieces of information which are formatted in a very specific way, which are formatted in essentially a repeatable pattern, right? That's what allows us to use things like iterators. So iterators are very important for transforming the data from one format into another, which suits our purposes. So Liquid provides a very basic for loop, but also allows for the usage of parameters like limit, like offset or range, and so on, which can be combined in different ways to make Jekyll quite flexible, if you will. So I'm going to illustrate some of the parameters by going through the different for loops which are currently being used on the Singapore CSS website. So this is a home page of the Singapore CSS website. And so what I wanted was for some of the details of the upcoming meetup. So in the implementation, every blog post is a meetup. So I wanted some details of the upcoming meetup to be displayed on the front page, appropriately formatted, of course. Not all of it, just some of it. And because Jekyll already has post as a predefined variable, we can use it to access all the posts in the _posts folder. Fair. So if I wanted to do something like that, I could do it fairly easily with the limit parameter. So I just set a value of 1 in the for loop. You can see for post in site.post, I put a limit 1. And what this does is it's going to give me the latest post based on the date front matter. Because for Jekyll, posts are in reverse chronological order by default. And then the next section on the home page is a preview list, right? A preview list of the 3 previous meetups. So in this particular screenshot, 44, and then I don't want to repeat 44. I want 43, 42, 41. Fair. Because redundancy. Anyways, so this is where the offset parameter comes in handy. So what I'll do is, in the second for loop, I would offset the post listing by 1. So what this does is it displays from the second post onwards. So with offset, you can essentially skip entire blocks of posts if that's what suits your use case. Now the other parameters like cycle, range, they haven't been necessary for me thus far, but maybe if I add more features to the site in future. Oh, now, and if I go back, you'll notice that table row is also an iterator, which I actually didn't know until I read the documentation. So if you have tables in your Jekyll site, you can use table row to generate the tables, just wrap it in table text, so that's pretty cool. Didn't know until read the documentation. So now moving on to variables, again, which are very useful things. Jekyll provides some predefined global and site variables, which cover a lot of common use cases. But Jekyll also allows us to create our own variables. So I feel that there are 2 categories of custom variables, right? The first type is the ones that you create via custom front matter. And then you can access these custom variables with the syntax of page dot whatever your variable name is. So that allows you to, oh yeah, it's on the slide. So custom front matter variables can be accessed via that syntax. Another way of creating custom variables in Liquid is actually to use assign or capture tags. Both of these are very similar, but slightly different things. Capture is a bit more powerful, I would say. As for the increment and decrement options, I have yet to discover a relevant use case for them. But if you have used it before, I'd love to hear about it. So the Singapore CSS website, right? It's always been a pet project of mine over these past more than 3 years. Our meetup is coming up to 4 years in November, and I'm kind of happy about that. And even though I doubt anybody actually visits the site, you know, it is my baby, and I love it regardless. So when I first started, you know, we had like a handful of meetups, like 5, right? And all the markup was just manually written because it was actually honestly faster when I had very few meetups. But as, you know, time went on, we had more and more meetups and the site grew. It started to not make sense anymore because every post had a similar format. So what I ended up doing was copying and pasting from the month before and then tweaking the values, like hard-coded. Clearly a good time for refactoring. But I was lazy. Oh, so lazy. I think by the time we hit meetup like 25 or something, I finally wanted to create a page to list all speakers because by then we had a good number of speakers. Thought it'd be nice to list them all onto a speakers page, and then I realized, it hit me, that the existing implementation made this idea quite unwieldy and unmaintainable. So that was essentially what motivated me to finally stop procrastinating and resolve this technical debt once and for all. So some planning was actually necessary in order to extract all these hard-coded values into data files that could be iterated upon. It wasn't as straightforward as using only one data file, because once I sat down and thought about the logic, I realized that each post represented one meetup. That's fine. But then each meetup had multiple speakers with their corresponding videos. Yes, but videos would not be repeated across meetups. However, speakers could be repeated because I would have repeat speakers, right? So then we also had variations where sometimes there would be no video because, video recordings fail sometimes. And then there were additional bits, additional sections in the recap. For example, a CSS color of the month, which I introduced in, I think, meetup number 14. And then there were like news updates in the world of HTML and CSS. That was also introduced much later much later on. So it did take quite a bit of, how should we put this, planning to make sure everything could be wired up together. Now my data format of choice is YAML, so all the examples you've been looking at are all YAML. And the key data file for this entire endeavor was actually the meetup.yaml file, because it was the one that kind of referenced both the speakers file and the videos file, and sort of ties all the data together, like forming the backbone of the information architecture of the site. So to access specific values in the file, the syntax ended up being rather long and unwieldy. So it looks like if you put your attention to the right block, you'd see that it's site.data.meetups, then a square brackets, and then a key value. It's like really long. Makes the code quite hard to read. So here's where assign came in really handy, because I could just use the assign tag to put all of that into a variable called meetup. Right, and then when I wanted to loop through video entries, because right now the meetup.yaml file, it can be considered a complex data structure, a complex YAML data structure, right? So I can loop with it. There's nested information in there. So if I wanted to loop through the video entries in the meetup data file, I'll be using those values as keys, referencing the videos data file. So a lot of it is making use of the matching of values in one file as the key of another in order to stitch all this data together. So if you're really interested and you dig into the source code, you'll find names like shortcode or ref, you can see right here, whose main purpose essentially is for the matching of key value pairs. Like the value here, I'm going to use as a key in the videos file, for example. So it's kind of like a foreign key in structured databases, I suppose, if that's a correct analogy to use. And then to deal with the fact that some sections on the site were added later on, for example, the CSS color of the month that I mentioned, I wanted some checking logic, right? So here's when Liquid's truthiness comes in handy. So I could check for meetup.color, and if this key does not exist in the entry on the meetup data file, the code block's not going to render, because this is one of the few cases where Jekyll returns nil, like false. It all sounds rather straightforward now that I've streamlined the explanation to the pertinent bits, but the actual implementation took me quite a while to figure out because I wasn't completely sure how Liquid's truthiness worked. And that is why I spent a slide and a half talking about it earlier. So if you look at the right side code block again, it's another template. I personally prefer doing an additional assign for aesthetic reasons, so the code is easier to read. But for something as short as this, meetup.color, you don't really have to if you're okay with the long form style. So it could be like meetup.color.name instead of color.name. It's a personal preference, I think. Now earlier on, I mentioned that the original motivation of moving everything into data files was that I wanted a listing of all speakers, right? So there are things called liquid objects, which I believe, if you refer to the liquid documentation, because the Jekyll documentation doesn't cover this, if I'm not wrong, most of the stuff in there should be supported on the Jekyll side as well. So one of the objects that I find pretty useful is the for loop object. What it is, it contains the attributes of its parent for loop. So this information, pretty useful, because what it did is allowed me to have a dynamically updated speaker count as part of the copy for my speakers page. So every time I added a new speaker to the file, the number in the double brackets count would update itself. So I didn't have to come back and change the copy on this page every time I added a new speaker. Because let's be honest, we're going to forget at some point. And finally, let's talk about capture. So again, capture, like assign, is kind of used to create custom variables in Jekyll. So with assign, you can wrap a variable in quotations to save it as a string. Now for capture, it will take all the content between the tags, then assign it to the variable. So it might appear that it's just this minor syntax difference, right? What's the point? The point here is that by using capture, you can use it to create complex strings that are made up of multiple string variables created through assign. So like combining variables created by assign, you do that using capture. So my particular use case was for conditional CSS in the head of my site. Granted, this is not entirely directly related to data files, but I think it's pretty useful to know about this. So we're just going to talk about it anyway. So I wanted the URL of my style sheet for certain pages because over the course of 45 meetups, I had 1 or 2 that were kind of special events that I wanted to have custom styling and everything. So for that, I would indicate to Jekyll that this particular post used custom CSS. So I had a front matter value of CSS, I think. And so that would be assigned, I would capture that as a string and then pass this string into capture so that I could generate a, what's the correct word for this? Pre-processed URL using liquid filters, Jekyll's liquid filters. Because one thing about filters is that all the liquid filters are supported by Jekyll, and in addition to those that are specific to Jekyll only, right? So the one I've used here, which is base URL, is a Jekyll specific filter, and the full list is available on the documentation site. And now with the templates all set up, I no longer have to type or copy and paste any markup code. The site is entirely managed by markdown files and front matter on each individual post, and those 3 data files that I showed earlier. So when a new speaker submits a talk, they are added to the speaker data file with the required information like name, social media handles, one-liner bios, and this information is used in the speaker HTML include file using shortcode as a reference to tie everything back. So the post itself is written in Markdown, and it has some custom front matter variables that are used in the templates as logic checks. So for example, before the meetup, there are no videos, so the front matter called no videos is set to true. And based on this logic check, markup for the video section is not going to render on the page. But once a meetup is done and dusted, the content of the post, which had previously been details of each speaker's talk, would be replaced by a short paragraph that acts as a recap of what happened. And then the no videos front matter would be removed, so then the videos get rendered, the video section gets rendered, and the color of the month information gets added to the meetup.yaml file as well, and then this ends up getting rendered on the recap page after. So all in all, I could have saved a lot of time by doing this refactoring bit way earlier. But oh well, life. So okay, I'm almost done here. One last thing I want to mention is that I wasn't too familiar with YAML when I started, but after a lot of trial and error, I did learn that the dash makes a difference in how the YAML file is parsed, particularly because I am using a slightly complicated data structure here. I was using the square bracket notation to iterate over videos and speakers, and those had to be a list. If I'd used the dictionary syntax, which is without the dash, my code didn't actually work. So I want to plug the Jekyll documentation, which I personally find really well written, and it should be your go-to reference whenever you want to implement something slightly more complicated than rendering front matter on your template. And I hope that some of the things I've covered today are useful to some of you. So thank you all for taking the time to listen to me talk about data files. If you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter, and I'll try my best to answer them. Also, if anyone is interested to see the source code of the entire website, we are on GitHub. The site is hosted on GitHub because I have an operating budget of $0. Just saying. And thank you all once again.
Thanks for that, Jing. Yeah, it was really interesting seeing the iteration that you've made on the Singapore site and slowly made it more and more maintainable. And I've been developing Jekyll for years, and I was not aware that Liquid doesn't have a not filter. Apparently, I've just never used it, and the table row filter is new to me as well. Thanks again.